They left before dawn, a small convoy of 6 men moving out from Forward Operating Base Harrington in Northern Coast Province. It was early spring, 2008. The air was thin and cool, and the hills were quiet. Too quiet, according to one of the mechanics who had been up checking their Humvees. The mission was routine, a perimeter sweep along a road they'd traveled dozens of times before. The kind of patrol you could almost do from memory. The men were from Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment. Good unit, well-trained, no rookies in the group. They radioed in at 0500, confirmed movement. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. When the comms officer tried to reach them again around 0530, there was nothing. Not static, not interference, just dead air. They'd gone maybe 6 miles out. The area was considered secure. No known insurgent presence, no IED activity. And yet, within 2 hours, a QRF team was on the move, following their tire tracks into a narrow valley and finding what no one could explain. The search team described it as if time had stopped halfway through an ordinary day. The first Humvee was parked at an odd angle, engine off, doors open, weapons still in their racks. The second vehicle sat about 50 meters behind it. Same story. There were no signs of ambush, no burn marks, no shell casings, no drag trails. The radios were functional. The keys were still in the ignitions. The dirt around the vehicles was disturbed, but not in the way you'd expect from a struggle. Just boot prints, overlapping, confused, leading in several directions, and then nowhere. About 30 meters off the trail, the ground had been freshly turned, as if someone had dug briefly and stopped. No shovel was ever found. What stood out most to the responding team wasn't what they saw, but what they didn't. There were no signs of panic, no hastily dropped gear, no blood. It looked as if the patrol had simply stepped out of their trucks and walked into the hills. One of the search team leaders, Staff Sergeant Eric Hall, later wrote in his after-action report that he felt a strange sense of stillness there. Like the sound didn't carry right, he said. We'd call out, and it felt like the air just swallowed it. He didn't elaborate further, but in a follow-up debrief, another member described hearing a rhythmic knocking echoing faintly from somewhere up the slope, though no one could pinpoint its source. By noon, additional units arrived to expand the search. Drones were launched. Aerial reconnaissance found nothing. The valley was less than 2 miles wide. There was nowhere to hide without leaving a trace. Yet by the end of that day, the patrol's 6 members were officially listed as missing. Military investigators went over the site for days. They cataloged every footprint, every shell casing from previous operations, every possible clue. Nothing suggested foul play. There was no sign of enemy contact or any mechanical issue with the vehicles. The only irregularity was environmental. The local villagers described hearing what they called the whisper wind that same morning, a low, drawn-out tone that seemed to come from the valley itself. Local superstition, perhaps. Coast is full of stories about that kind of thing. Echoes that don't bounce back, light that bends in fog, people who vanish in the folds of the mountains. Most soldiers dismissed it as folklore, but for the ones who were there, it became harder to ignore. A week later, a second team was tasked with mapping the terrain and setting up motion sensors. This was mostly a formality. The Army assumed the missing men were captured or had gone off-grid during a firefight. But the new patrol, led by Lieutenant Kearns, reported feeling the same static atmosphere. They used that phrase multiple times in their logs. Static atmosphere. Like pressure before a storm. Though the weather was clear, on their second night, one of their perimeter cameras picked up faint movement, thermal imaging of what looked like figures walking single file about 200 meters away. The shapes didn't match local nomads, too tall, too slow, too uniform. The sentries called it in, thinking it might be the missing patrol. But when they advanced, the shapes disappeared. The ground showed no new footprints in the area. 2 members of that recon team later said privately that they'd heard radio chatter that night. Fragments of English words. Someone saying, "We're here," and then silence. The comms logs show no such transmission. When command reviewed all data, imagery, radio, thermal, they classified it as unconfirmed optical distortion. Officially, the disappearance was attributed to potential capture by insurgent forces, though no group ever claimed responsibility. Unofficially, soldiers who rotated through that valley avoided the area. They called it the dead zone. Over the years that followed, pieces of the story circulated through other units. Some dismissed it outright. Others swore they'd experienced something similar. Equipment failure, echoes that sounded like voices, moments when GPS would loop coordinates as if the land itself was folding. A former contractor who worked in signals intelligence in that sector in 2009 recalled something interesting. We'd get these brief, low-frequency pulses in the radio bands around 40 to 50 hertz, he said. They'd last maybe 5 seconds, then disappear. Always between 0400 and 0500. We joked it was the missing patrol checking in. He smiled when he said it, but didn't seem amused. Even today, there's a quietness in those reports. Like everyone involved wants to forget, but can't. Some investigators suggested the men might have wandered off under the influence of carbon monoxide or dehydration, maybe a local gas pocket, maybe a form of disorientation. That explanation fits the data, but not the pattern of footprints, which seemed deliberate, measured, and led in a direction that didn't make sense. The last known mark was a partial heel print near a shallow ravine. Beyond that, smooth, untouched soil, as if the earth had been brushed clean. Years later, satellite images of the area show faint discoloration, elliptical, about 50 feet across, where the vehicles once stood. Locals say nothing grows there anymore. There's an unspoken rule among soldiers. Don't dwell on the ones who vanish, not because they're forgotten, but because if you start imagining how it happens, the mind can unravel fast. Still, the story of that patrol spread quietly across bases, each retelling slightly different, but always ending the same way. 6 men leave, and none return. In 2010, a documentary team embedded with an engineering unit operating near the same sector. They weren't there to investigate the disappearance, at least not officially, but one of the crew members later said they were warned about the area before going out. The warning wasn't from command. It came from a local interpreter, a man named Farid, who had worked with several US units over the years. Farid told them the valley had an older name before the maps were redrawn. Dar-e-Sokut, he said, the Valley of Silence. He said people avoided it long before the Americans arrived. Not because of Taliban presence, but because the ground forgets footsteps. When pressed, he explained in broken English that travelers who entered sometimes walked a long way, but came out a short distance later, speaking slowly like they had been gone for years. The engineers dismissed it as local myth. They were there to clear old ordnance and reinforce a small checkpoint near the entrance to the valley. Nothing mystical about it, but the cameraman from that team later wrote in his journal that their first night was wrongly still. He used those words, wrongly still. No wind, no insects, no night birds, just a low pressure that seemed to weigh on the air. He didn't mention this on film, but a week later, while reviewing footage, he noticed a frame anomaly. During a static shot of the checkpoint at dusk, 6 faint silhouettes appeared briefly against the ridgeline, too faint to identify, but oddly aligned, like soldiers on patrol. He said he thought it was a camera glitch. Yet when he showed it to the soldiers, they went quiet. One of them, who'd been stationed there years earlier, said softly, "That's their spacing. That's Bravo's spacing." That clip never aired. By that point, the Army had closed the original case. No remains, no sign of capture, no ransom videos, no chatter on insurgent channels. Nothing. The families were given folded flags and quiet condolences. On paper, it was one of many unresolved MIA reports. But inside the units who rotated through that region, there were other accounts, small ones. A squad that heard their own call signs coming through a dead radio net. A convoy that spotted a lone figure on the ridgeline at dawn, wearing outdated gear from a discontinued uniform pattern. Each incident explainable, each just strange enough to remember. In 2013, an Afghan shepherd found a rifle embedded in clay about 10 miles south of the valley. The serial number traced back to one of the missing men, Specialist Daniel Ruiz. It was buried upright, as if placed there carefully, barrel down, butt exposed to the sun. No remains were found nearby. The weapon was clean, free of corrosion, as though it had been buried only days before. The Army retrieved it, ran tests, and filed it under recovered equipment. The location didn't fit any known movement pattern. A retired officer from that time, who agreed to speak off record, said there had been internal debate about whether to reopen the case. But by then, the drawdown was underway. Priorities shifted. "You can't chase ghosts," he said, "especially not ones that don't show up on a map." Still, unofficial interest persisted. A few years later, a group of veterans who had served in that area began comparing notes online. They weren't conspiracy theorists, just men who wanted to understand what they'd seen. Some recalled malfunctions that always happened at the same coordinates: compasses spinning, night vision flickering, sudden loss of GPS lock. One described it as like walking through a signal blackout that moved with you. A physicist who later reviewed those coordinates suggested a simple explanation: magnetic anomalies, possibly linked to iron deposits or geological formations. And that's the sensible answer. But the veterans who had been there said the feeling went beyond instruments. It was physical, like walking into a vacuum. One even described it as a silence you could hear. That phrase came up more than once across testimonies, years apart, from people who had never met. A silence you could hear. There's an interesting historical footnote here. During the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, a similar incident was rumored to have occurred in roughly the same region. A motorized patrol disappeared for 3 days, then reappeared at a checkpoint miles away, disoriented, unable to recall what had happened. The Soviets classified the report, but fragments of it circulated later through declassified transcripts. The terrain coordinates match within a few miles, of where Bravo vanished. Whether that's coincidence or repetition depends on what you believe. There's also the question of the ground itself. A geological survey conducted in the late 90s noted an unusual magnetic reading in that valley, localized, fluctuating, and inconsistent with surrounding terrain. It was never studied further. Some said it might explain the radio failures. Others thought it was just interference from minerals. But there's something in those reports that feels human, not technical. Something about the way soldiers describe that place, not with fear, but with quiet confusion, as though they'd brushed against something that wasn't supposed to be noticed. It's easy to write these accounts off as stress, fatigue, the side effects of war, and that may be all it is. Long hours, heat, adrenaline, grief. The mind fills in blanks when it's stretched too thin. But then you read their words. Men trained to see, to measure, to report, and there's a consistency that's hard to ignore. One of the recovery team members from 2008, now retired, summed it up simply. "We didn't find them because there was nothing to find," he said. "No tracks, no blood, no fight. Just an ending that didn't finish." He paused when he said that. It felt like the story itself had stopped. And maybe that's what unsettles people most. Not the idea that something took them, but that something ended mid-sentence. And the rest of us were left standing in the silence, waiting for the next word. In the years since, the story of the lost patrol has shifted into that gray space between history and myth. Among veterans, it's a quiet reference, something mentioned late in conversation, when the night's almost over and the room has gone still. The younger soldiers hear it as a cautionary tale about terrain, about never letting routine dull your senses. The older ones talk about it differently, more as a reminder that some things in war are beyond reason. When I began collecting accounts, I expected patterns of exaggeration, the kind of distortion that happens over time. But what struck me instead was how measured everyone was. They weren't telling ghost stories. They were remembering details. The smell of oil and dust around the vehicles. The faint metallic taste in the air. The way sound fell flat, as if the valley itself absorbed it. One of the men who served in the area in 2014, part of a logistics unit, shared an experience he'd never reported officially. He said he'd been moving through the outskirts of the same valley when he saw 3 figures standing in the distance near a ridge. He raised his scope, expecting to see shepherds. Instead, he saw men in US fatigues, old pattern, faded, sun-bleached. They stood motionless, looking toward the valley. He called out in English, no response. When he lowered his scope for a moment and looked again, they were gone. He didn't write it up. He didn't tell his CO. "It wouldn't make sense in a report," he said. "You can't log what you can't confirm." Another veteran, a communications specialist, said he once picked up a faint voice loop on the emergency frequency while testing gear. The message was a single phrase, repeated twice, 06 to base. "Do you copy?" The voice was calm, steady, male. When he played it back, the timestamp read the same date and hour the original patrol disappeared. Just 8 years later, to the minute. He told himself it was a misrecorded training file. Still, he deleted it. There's a strange loyalty to the unknown in these stories. The men who were there don't embellish. They don't claim to know. They just remember, and remembering seems to be its own kind of duty. I spoke once with a chaplain who had been stationed in Coast during those years. He said the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was the uncertainty. A body gives closure, he said. A mystery doesn't. It lingers. It becomes a shape you can't see, but it's always there in the room. He told me something else too. On the anniversary of the disappearance, a few soldiers would quietly gather at the edge of the FOB. They'd turn off the radios, stand in silence for a few minutes facing the valley, and then walk away. No ceremony, no prayer, just acknowledgement, like sending a signal that might or might not be received. There are always rational explanations. Every expert I've spoken to has one. Disorientation, cognitive stress, human error, psychological contagion. And those explanations matter. They remind us not to lose our footing in imagination, but they also don't explain why certain details repeat across time, across voices, the silence, the air pressure, the sense that something familiar had turned slightly wrong. One theory suggested that a geological feature in the valley might distort sound and electromagnetic fields in a way that disorients people. The dead zone, some reported, could be a natural phenomenon, a perfect convergence of rock, magnetism, and air pressure. But even that leaves questions. Why that morning? Why those men? Why no sign at all? Not even bones? The most unnerving accounts are the smallest. A mechanic who worked on those vehicles said he still dreams about cleaning their interiors. They were spotless, he said, too clean, like someone had wiped them down. He paused before adding, even the footprints inside the cab were gone. Another soldier, years later, described walking through the same valley during a later mission and finding his boot sinking slightly into soft soil. When he looked down, he saw the edge of a canvas strap just below the surface. He pulled, expecting old gear. It was a rifle sling, standard issue, faded, frayed. He left it where it was. By then, the story had grown into something unspoken in official circles. It wasn't superstition so much as a quiet respect. No one wanted to disturb what had already gone missing. The valley remains off limits to patrols now, officially due to unstable terrain. Unofficially, it's just avoided. Locals still refer to it as the Valley of Silence. Sometimes on clear nights, villagers claim they see small lights moving along the ridgeline, like distant flashlights. When asked, they say it's just the soldiers still walking. Maybe it's a trick of light. Maybe it's memory itself, echoing back across years of war, repeating the same small patterns that never quite resolve. It's easy to imagine what might have happened. A wrong turn, a hidden ravine, a tragic accident erased by wind and time. But something in the reports, the neatness, the stillness, makes that feel incomplete. There's an absence that feels intentional, as if whatever happened didn't leave room for witnesses. Sometimes I think about that first description from Staff Sergeant Hall. We'd call out, and it felt like the air just swallowed it. There's something in that image that stays with you, a sound that doesn't return, a message sent out that never echoes back. That's how loss works, in war or otherwise. It's not always violence. Sometimes it's just silence, the moment when communication ends, and no one knows why. When people ask what I think really happened, I tell them I don't know. And that's not evasion, it's honesty. Some stories are not meant to conclude neatly. They linger, unresolved, because the questions they raise are more human than the answers we invent. Whether those men were taken, lost, or simply vanished into the folds of time, the truth remains the same. They were there one moment and gone the next. Their absence is the only evidence we have. And so, the story continues in quiet retellings, in late-night conversations, in the pause between radio checks, in the sound of static that isn't quite empty, whether these were hallucinations, legends, or something else entirely. These stories have been shared for decades, and for the people who experienced them, they were very real. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening and for remembering. Stories like this aren't about proving what's real or what isn't. They're about the spaces left behind and the people who keep listening to the silence. If you want to hear more stories like this about war, memory, and the things that stay unexplained, subscribe, stay watchful, and take care of each other out there. Until next time, keep your comms open.